My name is John Garcia, and I work at the American Antiquarian Society. So this is a really interesting example of the Declaration of Independence. This is actually the first official version printed in Massachusetts. If you look at the bottom here, that it said it's printed by order of authority, which also shows us that when the Declaration was circulating, they wanted to make sure that they had the official version out there. And it was printed in Salem, Massachusetts by a printer named Ezekiel Russell. My favorite part about this one is that beneath the main text that we're all at this point very familiar with, there's an additional part that was added specifically for the Massachusetts version, which tells us here, copies of this were to be sent to every clergyman in every denomination across the Commonwealth. What they intended was that this would be sent for free to various religious clergymen across the state of Massachusetts, and they're told explicitly that the Declaration is to be read at the end of the service. The Declaration was really a spoken document. And it's a reminder that even somebody who was perhaps didn't have the ability to read, they were still able to access the Declaration through a kind of oral form like this in a church. Well, the 18th century is such a fascinating period. We start to see the development of a reading public that emerges in relationship to things such as newspapers, bookstores, subscription libraries, and also even coffee houses. By the time of the 1770s, when we start to see the origins of the American Revolution, these venues become an important site for political debate. And so printers are really key agents in spreading ideas that the public responded to. But in addition to this, I would also emphasize the emergence of a popular culture that is also deeply embedded in the print culture of the time. We have things such as joke books, poetry, broadside ballads, and many other forms of what we would now think of as entertainment. There's also a taste for novels. Now, the one other, I think, important consideration here is to recognize that print culture in this time is much more diverse. We start to see in the 1770s the first indigenous writers who published pamphlets. We also start to see black poets such as Phillis Wheatley. And these figures are also equally important for understanding the context of the print culture and the material that everyday Americans may have encountered in their daily lives. The real impact of print is something that historians have debated for years. Some people have said that the ideas that were spread through pamphlets really helped to cement the kind of political philosophy that drove the American Revolution. Other historians have said that, print has a real interesting relationship to oral culture. And I think that is something that we really need to recognize as we think about the 250th. Now, the Declaration of Independence we often see as an iconic printed broadside. But the Declaration itself really resembles a speech. We see that even in the title, Declaration. Jefferson, alongside with his other collaborators, really wanted this document to be something that could be recited and really to publish these ideas in the realm of public opinion. What does it mean to make something public? And in the 18th century, that often goes back to oral speech, to sharing information in real time, face-to-face. A pamphlet creates a public. The idea of even reading a pamphlet silently by yourself is kind of a misconception. Newspapers, pamphlets, and the like were often read in public, and they were shared amongst other people. And of course, a pamphlet is something that could be handed to somebody else. You wouldn't necessarily keep it to yourself. I think today, we're very much attuned to the effects of media and the way that media exists in a structure, in a kind of infrastructure, so to speak. This is also the case for print culture. Printers often were deeply embedded in the postal system. You have to remember that a pamphlet or a book doesn't just arrive and appear out of nowhere. There has to be people involved at every stage of the production process. So you'll have numerous people in the print shop. You also have somebody who has to fold the pamphlet and stitch it and bind it. And then of course you have the distribution systems. One place that one would go, of course, we would think of as a bookstore. Printers sold pamphlets out of their shops, but they also were often mailed. And here again we see the importance of the postal system. And it's no accident that a famous printer such as Benjamin Franklin was also somebody who was in charge of the post office and actually had a real important influence on the postal system across the North American colonies. The print culture of the time was a way, more broadly, to exercise a form of resistance against the British monarchy. That's a really big topic, but I would always take us back to a very specific pamphlet, arguably the most important pamphlet of the era, and that would be Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Paine really transformed the revolutionary movement, and he did so through a pamphlet. Now, one thing that I think makes somebody like Paine really resonate with today is that he took a much different tone compared to the contemporary writers, the more elite, learned lawyers who often wrote in the form of long pamphlets and kind of political philosophy. Paine took a much different approach. He wrote for the everyday person. And he did something I think that's truly important for understanding both the revolution and also the way that print continues to inform resistance, and that's rage. Paine was not afraid to get people riled up. More than anybody else, he targeted the British monarchy, and he used everyday language and kind of common reasoning. That's, of course, in the title, Common Sense. And he said, why should a continent of this size be ruled by an island across the sea? And it's this kind of real everyday kind of approach that really resonated with people. And so Paine, I think, more than anybody else, deserves to be recognized as a kind of a real starting point for thinking about print, popular resistance, and the ways in which a pamphlet can reach a wide audience. Arguably, this sets a kind of template that could be used much later. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world. Now, this comes out a bit later in 1829, but Walker took a similar approach. He wrote with real justified anger, and he said, why, 50 years later, have we not lived up to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence? And in David Walker's appeal, he almost goes line by line, and he says, look at this. He even directed the printers to use what we call a manucle, or a printer's fist. We would think of it today as a pointing finger. And so even on the level of type, in the arrangement of materials on the page, he really wanted people to think of his pamphlet as a direct response to the ideals of the American Revolution, and of course also the goal of continuing those ideals and to spread the kinds of rights language and the kind of real access to citizenship, to the right to assemble, and of course to end slavery. Arguably, early print culture had its own understanding of its future. A document was not always just about the immediate moment. And here I'm thinking of something that should equally be celebrated, and that's the first black newspaper. The title of it is called Freedom's Journal. It was published in 1827 in New York City. Like David Walker's appeal, it also responded to the promises of the Declaration of Independence and the failures at the time to realize those promises for everyone. But a newspaper such as Freedom's Journal was also aware of its legacy. The printers and the writers thought about what will come after this? What's possible now? Once we have black communities publishing newspapers and books for their own audiences and taking it upon themselves to get their words out there. Now, this anniversary is coming up next year. 2027 is the 200th anniversary of the publication of Freedom's Journal in 1827. Again, at a place like the American Antiquarian Society, when there's so much emphasis on anniversaries and commemorations, Freedom's Journal is really something that we would like to think should be remembered just as equally, arguably, with the 250th. Because it also helps us to think about the legacies today. What is it like today in the landscape of journalism? What does it mean to be a Black journalist today? What is the relationship to everyday reporting and to the long history of journalism that shapes American history? I mentioned David Walker, Freedom's Journal, and the early Black press. But almost around the same time, we start to see indigenous newspapers. And by that I mean newspapers, sometimes bilingual, sometimes printed entirely in a Native American language. Freedom's Journal is published in 1827. Just 1 year later, we see the Cherokee Phoenix, originally printed in Georgia, later moves to Oklahoma. The Cherokee Phoenix, of course, was a really impressive, really landmark effort. First of all, we had to have Sequoyah step in to create the syllabary. In other words, an alphabet that could be used by printers. You had to have the type manufactured. This took labor as well, took a big investment. But the Cherokee Phoenix exemplifies, yet again, the way in which newspapers and journalism were central to responding to social inequalities of the day. These newspapers had a very small circulation, but people definitely read them and they saved them. And there are numerous indigenous newspapers published across the 19th century. This might seem like a niche topic, but I will also point out that the Cherokee Phoenix continues to be published today. And Native people and also many other audiences still receive printed copies of the Cherokee Phoenix. And they read it and they cherish it, which reminds us, once again, that print is not dead. It simply is consumed maybe a little bit differently. Somebody like Mary Katharine Goddard is a fascinating figure. And she also reminds us that women are always important for the printing press in early America. The first press that arrives in Cambridge, New England in 1639 was actually owned by a woman. Somebody like Benjamin Franklin relied on his spouse, Deborah, to help him run the shop. There are so many examples of women who made real contributions to printing and publishing. Mary Goddard, I think she gets a lot of attention for printing the Declaration of Independence. Her version is the first version to feature the names of the signers. By 1777, of course, there were numerous printings of the Declaration, sometimes for commercial purposes. But Goddard's placement of her name there is very much a kind of signature. In a very small way, maybe a very unassuming way, she's making sure that people know that this was her work. This came out of her shop. Now, it's not a claim for authorship, but again, it's a reminder that printers play an important role. A great historian named Elizabeth Eisenstein said that printers were agents of change and that they contributed to a revolution of their own, which is called the printing revolution and a reading revolution. And Goddard was certainly somebody who fits within that tradition. Democracy and journalism are, of course, deeply intermeshed. And even before we have quote-unquote democracy, we have print, and we have writers who are getting their ideas out there, and they always assumed an informed public, an interested public. And the kinds of standards and expectations that we think about for today's journalism are really grounded in the longer history of print. Editorial boards, the idea of topical news, even the idea of stop the press and let's correct things, let's add an extra issue. You know, newspapers going back to the penny press in 1830s New York City, they were always constantly thinking about standards of truth, sometimes playing with standards of truth, sometimes printing hoaxes. But these early papers, even up to today, were always attuned to the idea that you have to get things right sometimes. It's often overlooked that young people also have a deep connection to print culture. Children's literature, of course, was a major way that printers supported themselves and covered the bottom line. But we also need to remember that in the 19th century, almost 50% of the population was under the age of 18. So children are always major consumers of print, be it a religious publication, maybe a school book, maybe a grammar book. There are so many kinds of materials that are out there, and printers recognized early on that the education market and that writing for children was just as important as publishing a novel or a more serious history. It's also really interesting to think about children as producers of print. As you get deeper into the 19th century, you start to see what they call hobby presses, the kinds of things that you could buy and have delivered to you through the mail. These would be tabletop, small printing presses that young people actually use to print their own newspapers. We often call this an amateur newspaper. But I think that also kind of diminishes the significance of these publications as another way to understand the longer connection between youth and print. I think really, we as Americans really want to have a usable past. And documents like the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they really help us understand the importance of writing and publication to the formation of the United States. Now, these documents are also contested. We often think today, what do they mean? What was the original intent? But we also have to understand the context. And truly, I think that that's one of the lessons that we can draw today, is that a document like the Declaration of Independence could have multiple meanings to different people. But I always want us to think about the documents themselves. Why are we interested in the Declaration? Well, today, we really want to go and look at the things themselves. And it's the primary document. It's really looking at the object. Now, I think over the years, we might think of the Declaration of Independence as a set of words, as something that could easily be reproduced on a screen. We also want to have a tangible relationship to something that's so foundational to this country. And that's why a place like the American Antiquarian Society saves these materials. And we want to make them publicly available. We want people to come in and look at it and to think about the paper and to think about the typography. How are these decisions informing the Declaration? How does it help us understand how it was read or how it was spoken aloud? What were the decisions that were made on the very minute level by printers who arguably played just as important of a role as the writers and the framers behind these various texts?